The 2023 fantasy football season is beginning right now. I am Alfredo Brown. I'm joined by the awesome Dr. Vignesh Doraiswamy. You're taking a break from saving lives, buddies. Hi, how you doing?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm better now.
I was talking to Dave. Sorry, not you, Alfredo. How
I'm
you,
doing
Dave?
great, Dr. Vig. I hope that I get introduced as the awesome Dave Kluge because you gotta really set the bar high there with that introduction, Alfredo.
No, sir, Dave. Your introduction is even better because we are joined by Fantasy Sports Writers Association Award nominee Dave Kluge. Congratulations! So that's got to be an awesome feeling for you and your show, The Launchpad.
Yeah, it is a very awesome feeling, very unexpected, very surprising. I didn't even know I was nominated. So when I saw that tweet that I made it as a finalist, I'm just thrilled and honored to be a part of such an illustrious group.
Oh, well, we've been away for a couple of weeks. For those of you that normally watch and listen, you're like, where the guy's been? We took a little time off, but in the words of the immortal Tony Stark, it is good to be back. RIP. Spoiler alert, by the way, if you haven't seen all the Avengers stuff. Today, the three of us, we're taking a look back at all the craziness of the 2022 fantasy football season. And we're a show that I think prides itself on us learning and us trying to teach and pass along those lessons. So today, we're going to give you the lessons that we have learned from the 2022 fantasy football season and how they can help you going into the 2023 season. Dave, kick us off with your first lesson from the 2022 fantasy football season.
Now, this is a lesson that I learned the hard way because I was fading a few of these guys and really ate a lot of crow early in the offseason. But my lesson is a simple one. Don't let an offseason acquisition scare you away from a talented wide receiver. Now, there's a few guys that I'm talking about specifically when I mention this. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, and Devonta Smith, who finished as, funny enough, the wide receiver 7, wide receiver 8, and wide receiver 9 back-to-back. They both took huge steps forward despite the additions of DJ Chark, Tyreek Hill, and A.J. Brown. And we saw it throughout this offseason. As somebody who plays a ton of best ball, I did over 500 drafts last offseason. I'm constantly watching the trends of player ADPs. And as soon as A.J. Brown showed up in Philadelphia, everybody lost faith in Devonta Smith. The same thing happened with Amon-Ra St. Brown when DJ Chark was added and they drafted Jameson Williams. And the same thing happened with Jalen Waddle when Tyreek Hill was brought in. And there's obviously some outliers to the rule. Elijah Moore, not really sure what happened with him, but, Garrett Wilson and Corey Davis showed up and Elijah Moore just didn't really get the looks this year. And then we're looking at 2021 Brandon Ayuk, who was in the doghouse kind of start half the season. So that's a peculiar case that I'm not going to read too deeply into. Then I think Hunter Renfrow was another big one that, really fell off a cliff just when Davante Adams showed up. But like I said, Ayuk was kind of this peculiar case and has since been a top 15 wide receiver with George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel. It doesn't matter. Talent is going to win out. Cream is going to rise to the top. Elijah Moore, I'm not completely writing him off yet. And because of this lesson, I think that means that I'm going to be in on Elijah Moore for the 2023 season, despite some of his struggles last year. And then Hunter Renfrow, I mean, really, I just don't think that he is an uber talented guy. Like talking about Jalen Waddle and Devonta Smith and Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's a subpar athlete who really only saw production when Waller was out a couple of years ago. But really what it comes down to is that the risk outweighs the reward. Yeah, you might get a Hunter Renfrow, but looking at these other guys that all finished top 10 in their position, despite having massive offseason acquisitions, it's really hard to not draft these guys again going forward. Waddle was being drafted as a wide receiver 19. Amon-Ra St. Brown was drafted as a wide receiver 22. And you can get Devonta Smith last year as the wide receiver 36, and all of them gave us wide receiver 1 seasons. So this offseason, there's going to be a lot of movement. We're hearing about DeAndre Hopkins and Devontae Adams and Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and Brandon Ayuk and T. Higgins and all of these guys potentially on the trade block. Regardless of where they show up, I'm going to make sure not to ding the wide receiver too much if that guy is a top tier athlete.
This is fantastic. Alfredo, sorry if I just go first, but I think this is a really, really great case because people do this all the time. This is a minor example, and I'm biased. You can see my Jags hanging behind me, but like Calvin Ridley coming to the Jags, and all of a sudden Christian Kirk is plummeting in his ADP. And he's another, I'm not saying he's going to be like a top 12 guy again. I think he could be, actually. And I sometimes putting him in like the 14 to 15 range feels a little disrespectful. But again, another great example, I think, in my mind at least, because I'm biased. But I want to take the lesson here, which is just because you have a talented wide receiver joining, don't be afraid. I like it a lot.
Yeah, Vig, I love that example there with Christian Kirk in Jacksonville, because I think there's more to it than just how talented that wide receiver is and then the guy coming in too. Like, you have to look at all the little new football. So many players that contribute to this. You've got to look at all the nuances. And I think that, for those people who were very excited about Elijah Moore, maybe they were kind of overlooking Zach Wilson or assuming Zach Wilson is going to take that next leap. And I think that's what you do in fantasy football. But then those people who are like, no, Zach Wilson's garbage, that's not going to happen, they're laughing and saying, see, I didn't take Elijah Moore, I knew it. And then Dave, what you bring up is just so important. It's separating that you can have a good player that's in a bad situation, and sometimes they can still rise above that, right? And then other times you end up with a DJ Moore, right? Who we've been waiting for the breakout now for years and years and years, or a Terry McLaurin. But yeah, I think we saw some guys with absolutely elite profiles this past year just absolutely perform. And I think so much of that too just comes from them being in good offenses. You mentioned Amon-Ra, Jalen, and Javonte. The Lions, Dolphins, Eagles, those three offenses as a whole got so much better. And so I think that's also going to be the thing to look out for. Lesson number 2 for the show. Vig, what did you learn in 2022?
I think you expect me to give an injury or a sports injury related lesson. I think that's what I'm going to do for both of mine today. First, I want to talk about, very basic, but talk about what you know, right? So I want to talk about Achilles injuries a little bit. And my big takeaway is that as far as running backs are concerned, especially in the first year that they come back from an Achilles injury, that Achilles heel is truly an Achilles heel. People will always talk about, yes, I love what I did there too. People will always talk about how there are folks who've come back and done well, right? And in fact, honestly, for football, I don't know that we can say that. We saw maybe Akers towards the end of the season kind of being the Akers that we know and love a little bit, but not quite there yet. The best success story of all time maybe is what D'Onta Foreman is still what you got. So it's a little hard to know for sure. Medicine is better. People are healing faster. Rehabilitation science is exquisite. You were seeing people come back sooner. But again, we saw what J-Rob and Akers were this year. We remember the hype from last year. Everyone was like, ETN is nothing. J-Rob's the RB1. Fade Darrell Henderson all the way. It was going to be Akers' year, but the Achilles is so very important. This is not the time to necessarily say, think about Kevin Durant, think about Kobe Bryant. It's a slightly different sport. Now, those guys are excellent, and they did come back. And we know that our football players will come back. But for running backs, the power generation is affected so much that especially in year one, I don't know that these are players that I am very high on. Chris Towers from CBS had a great thread. It's a little over a year ago now, but an Excel sheet that he had with every single player and the difference in their production afterwards. Again, Foreman was the only one who looked even reasonably decent. And that feels hard to say because Foreman himself it's not like he's an outstanding fantasy football player,
what are you talking about? The Panthers' rushing attack got better because of D'Onta Foreman. All they had to do was get rid of Christian McCaffrey, and they got instantly better. Okay, get your medicine and your science and your data out of here because you're wrong.
The Ewing effect, as I don't know if you guys are familiar with Bill Simmons' work, but you get rid of the best player on offense, and everybody else steps up.
Yep. As a Knicks fan from Queens, I'm painfully aware of the Ewing effect. But I guess here's my question to one of you two, because what I would plan on doing is maybe buying the injury discount on some of these guys when they come back. But have you all given this any thought?
So, Dr. Vig, I'm far from the professional here, but one thing that stood out to me is you said, in their first year back, they struggle, and we've seen that. I mean, Cam Akers, it was miraculous. He came back in 4 or 5 months or something like that, but he looked pretty terrible. And then to start last year, he also looked pretty terrible, but we did start to see some signs towards the end of the year that are, what we got excited about Cam Akers as a rookie. So I guess my way that I'm looking at this is I like betting on modern medicine because, 10 years ago, an ACL was a death knell. And then 5 years ago, an Achilles was a death knell. And then I think that, the Liz Frank injury was a death knell until Travis Etienne kind of put that to rest this year as well. So would you think that maybe these guys coming off an injury, you should buy low on the year after when you see that big dip in production with James Robinson and Cam Akers last year? Do you think that maybe now next year in 2023, being 2 years removed from the Achilles, we can see them start to ramp up a little bit like D'Onta Foreman did? Because it took him almost 3 full years to finally be back to what we look like is 100%.
Yeah, and that's what I really want to get at is I think that, we were talking about this earlier. If a guy comes back and looks like crap, that's when someone's going to want to sell. And that's maybe when I want to buy, knowing that I'm not buying him for this year. So great for Dynasty sort of stuff. There has seriously never been a single running back who, regardless of running back style, regardless if you're a pass catching back, if you're like the actual 3-down back, if you're the guy you put at the goal line, none of them have been back and been reasonable or even really, truly decent fantasy football producing guys in their first year or even maybe their second year. Well, time will tell. We'll have to see what J-Rob and Akers are like. But I love betting on modern medicine. I love not betting too much against historical data. So I think, yeah, that year 1 is still very nebulous, and I'm not very confident. But year 2, I'm pretty excited for what's to come next year for J-Rob and Cam Akers.
Really quick, I have to address something that is not fantasy football related here at all. Dave, stop calling him Dr. Vig. Okay,
yeah, dude, no one calls
you
me that.
guys
It's
know
so
each
weird.
other
Just
on
call
a
me
first
Vig.
name.
I know this is so weird. Yeah, everyone calls me Vig.
It's a respect thing.
I don't need any of that. I really don't need any of that.
Tip my hat to you for the title that you work so hard for.
Oh, dude, it's totally fine. Like my patients don't even call me Dr. Vig, so please just call me Vig. That's a good point.
I'm sorry, Dr. Doraiswamy.
Oh my God! By the way, Vig, a tip of the hat to you, sir, for using the word modicum on the show sheet here. It's just fantastic.
I didn't use it here because I knew you'd give me
say
crap,
it,
and you still brought it up. And you still
wrote it.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
of
wrote
course, I'm going to
modicum.
bring it up. Yeah, Dr. Vig. Lesson number 3 here, and this is my lesson, and I think that you're going to hear this from a lot of different places, and this is not news, but I think this is something that is trending very differently in the NFL, and it's that for fantasy football, an elite QB is a must if you are looking to set yourself apart from your league mates, okay? I think the first thing you want to do is whenever we talk about these things, right? I think that a lot of terms get tossed around. Let's just define, what does it mean to be elite, right? What, at least in fantasy terms, right? Because I think all that stuff can be debatable, guys. But elite player, would you guys agree? An elite player is someone who creates a notable points per game differential between them and the next tier within their position group. Like guys like Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen. They were on a totally different level than the other quarterbacks. Would you say that's elite in terms of fantasy football?
Yeah.
Okay, so we got our
like tier 1. Tier 1 is elite, right?
Yeah. So we got, those are our tier 1 guys, and they're hovering around the 25, 26 points per game. You got your tier 2 quarterbacks, Joe Burrow, Justin Fields, Lamar Jackson, around 21 points per game. And then you start to dip down a little bit, where this is where, so many people who have championed the late round QB, shout out to JJ Zacharyson, but so many people who have championed that strategy kind of rest their hat on, well, quarterbacks, 7 through 12, they're all getting about 18.5 points per game. And there's not much difference at that point. But we've reached the point in fantasy football where upper echelon quarterbacks and then your average quarterback, if you're talking about a difference of either 25 or 18, Vig, do some quick math for me, please.
7.
What? No.
7. 25 minus 18.
Wow.
25
Good
minus
math.
18 is 7.
Good math.
Oh,
good math. This is why it's a fantasy football podcast.
You had me thinking I forgot how to do math with your pause there.
This is why it's a fantasy football podcast and not a math podcast. But anyways, if you're
Big
talking
numbers,
about
guys here.
players, analytics, baby. If you're talking about a player who can give you a 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8-point advantage every single week, almost nearly guaranteed, that's what gives you the big advantage over the rest of the managers in your league. And you start to look at what are the factors, right, that helped a lot of these top fantasy quarterbacks be elite in 2022. And a big thing was obviously the rushing. You heard some of those names I listed there. 5 of the top 7 quarterbacks in fantasy points per game average at least 38 rushing yards per game or more. You're talking about Justin Fields, obviously, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Kyler Murray. These are all names to think about next year when you're drafting, and drafting early. The other thing was look for good offenses. And I think that's one of our themes here, Dave, like that we talked about earlier, is good offenses with wide receivers, is quarterbacks that are going to get the passing touchdowns, right? And sometimes touchdowns, it's not always easy to assess. But typically a good quarterback and a good offense with good targets that they can move the ball down the field, you're going to see that. That's what we saw with Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow. 3 of the top 4 quarterbacks threw for 35 touchdowns or more. So rushing and good offenses, 2 ways that you can really try to establish this going into next year's drafts and find these elite QBs is invest early. Invest early in one of these just top tier, premier, elite, whatever term you want to use, quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen. Or you do what a couple other people did this year, which is you get lucky and you find one of those undeveloped guys with the elite traits and high potential. Dave's laughing because he did this. You go and you grab a Justin Fields while everyone else is sleeping on him. Vig did this. You go and you grab a Trevor Lawrence in the 13th round. And that's where these guys were being drafted, Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence. And maybe Lawrence didn't quite get up into that upper echelon just yet, but I think that's something we could see next year. They can push their offenses to elite statuses. That's something Jalen Hurts did this year, right? And a lot of people were in on him. Some were out. I was one of those idiots that was out, and I didn't think that could happen, and it did. And that's what paid off so big for fantasy managers. And I think there's a few guys, if I can make some predictions here, that you can watch out for in 2023. It could be, I think Justin Fields is the obvious one. I think he's an obvious QB1 overall candidate. The Bears have to make a lot of moves, but he could find himself in a very similar situation to Jalen Hurts, where the passing improves, the targets around him improves, the offense as a whole improves, and his rushing upside, I think, is better than anyone right now in all those quarterbacks listed. And then some other guys a little bit lower down that list: Trey Lance, Jordan Love. I know it's crazy because they may not even be the starting quarterbacks on their team, but these are guys that could potentially have good weapons around them. Trey Lance at least can provide some excellent rushing upside. Jordan Love is one of those guys that was compared to Patrick Mahomes and coming out of the draft because of his big arm. I think that these are some of those guys just to keep an eye on. I'm not saying go out and I'm not putting my name on them, but players to keep an eye on because, man, elite quarterback, it just helps you so much.
Yeah, for all of you early season best ball drafters right now, Tom Brady retired. Brock Purdy is having Tommy John surgery, and Trey Lance is currently being drafted as QB 19. I mean, he has the profile to take that huge step forward like we saw from Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence last year. So you already threw the name out there. But yeah, I mean, I was a little bit off of Trey Lance last year when he worked his way up into that QB 7 discussion. Thought that price tag was a little bit steep, but getting him now as QB 19 in one of the last rounds of your draft, I can't get enough of Trey Lance.
And I think that the general idea here, again, with the high-powered offense, just it's warrant talking about, right, for a second. We're talking about high-powered offenses. If you're going to talk about wide receivers that you are expecting to be in the top 12, top 15, top 24, someone's throwing them the football, right? So, I know people talk about this all the time, but sometimes I just see people not want to take a quarterback high, but are touting those wide receivers all the time. So, this is just to bring up Tua, who we haven't talked about at all, but assuming Tua is healthy,
we almost went one episode, Vig. I
had to do it for you. If you're going to bring my modicum, I was going to bring up your Tua.
We talked about Fields, we talked about Lawrence, we talked about Tua, all within the span of like 5 minutes. We did it, guys. I can mark that off the checklist. Thanks.
All right, that's all I was really getting at. I was trying to find a way to work Tua into this conversation, but I think the big picture point still holds. Guys, go grab your elite quarterbacks.
All right, really quick, I want to take a moment and talk about this fantastic gentleman who is here joining us on the show today. And I want to promote his fantastic show. Dave Kluge has his show, The Launchpad. As I mentioned before, it has been nominated as the best fantasy football podcast by the Fantasy Sports Writers Association. And honestly, it's a really cool concept. Dave, I've guested on a couple times. Vig, I believe that you have been on as well. If not, I'm putting Dave out there. Vig, have you been on?
No.
All right, so we're gonna make that change. This promo is going.
We did really talk about one for this offseason.
But we did. We
will be coming on.
We really did. We really did. Just
Dave, you got an awesome concept here. You bring together two guests from the fantasy industry, one very notable analyst, like Dr. Vig, and one up and comer, to discuss some of the biggest topics here in the NFL and fantasy football. It's an award-nominated show, so it's got to be good if that's what the critics are saying. It's going to return next Friday. He's got amazing guests. He's bringing on Pat Fitzmaurice and Jay Arsh to come on together, and you can find that only here on Football Guys on our YouTube channel and our podcast stream. Dave, let's get to lesson number 4. Tell us what you learned here in the 2022 fantasy football season.
And I wouldn't say this is anything that I specifically learned this season, and we've already alluded to this multiple times throughout this show, but I just need to throw it out there because some people still haven't caught up yet. When in doubt, draft the guy who you think is going to be on a better offense. It's really that simple. Some of the biggest breakouts that were unexpected this year were Miles Sanders, Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard. There were huge values in drafts this season, and the common denominator, they were all on very high-powered offenses. And some of the biggest non-injury busts that we saw this year, Najee Harris, Alvin Kamara, Michael Pittman, DJ Moore, Kyle Pitts, he had the injury, but was quite a bust before that injury. And what did they have in common? They were all on terrible offenses. I looked at it this morning, and the top 5 teams averaged 470 points scored on offense. The bottom 5 teams averaged 292. So you're looking at over a 60% difference between the top 5 teams and the bottom 5 teams, which just lends to so many more scoring opportunities. So this isn't any groundbreaking revelation or something you haven't heard before. But when you start drafting these teams and you're sitting there in round 8 and you're looking at 2 running backs and one of them is on a team that you're not expecting much from and one of them is on a high-powered offense, really the difference maker should be drafting the guy on a better offense. If you're torn between the wide receiver 3 on San Francisco and the wide receiver 2 on the Chicago Bears, take the wide receiver 3 on San Francisco because there are going to be so many more scoring opportunities and chances for spike weeks.
This, I think, is actually not as straightforward as you think. In my mind, it is. It's very straightforward. But there are so many people out there, Dave, who still believe in drafting the better talent. and they swear by the better talent. So if you're one of those, this is the better talent, I'm going to grab him, guys. Guys, please listen to Dave. Time and time again, we've seen it happen. The better offense is where you get better points. So, Dave, I do agree. I mean, I said it wasn't straightforward. I think it is straightforward. I just think there are some people who are so stuck to the idea that this is the guy, he's got the talent, and because of that, he's going to be so good. But I think time and again, we've learned, and again, we've seen it. We saw it again this year. I loved your examples. Go with the better offense.
Yeah, I mean, how many times were people in drafts this year and selecting Kareem Hunt and Nyheim Hines over Tony Pollard, who gave us a top 10 fantasy season? And really, I mean, obviously Tony Pollard is younger and has a better profile, but I think the biggest difference maker there was that Dallas was hanging 30 points a week and the Browns and the Colts weren't. So yeah, when in doubt, draft a guy on a better offense. Really simple.
Yeah, and Vig, not to necessarily combat what you're saying about, it doesn't always have to be. I think there's just a lot of layers to this, like in terms of talent and opportunity and stuff like that. And I'm one of those people that I have found myself very guilty of saying, "Ooh, this guy's going to get hyper targeted, and there's going to be a lot of opportunity," and that doesn't always matter. Like if you get a lot of opportunity in a bad offense, it doesn't matter. You're DJ Moore, like that. That's what happens. Right. And we've seen it where Najee Harris was a guy that I thought was going to he's going to get a lot of run this year. I think he can still maintain some value in the passing game, not as much. And sure, he got his volume, but it wasn't quite the same. And then getting an adjusted volume on a bad offense really didn't help when going out and getting a guy like Josh Jacobs that we all overreacted to in the preseason, who we're sitting here saying, well, Devontae Adams is added to this team. Darren Waller's coming back. All these things should make this offense better and put the Raiders in more scoring opportunities. And we just looked at it. We're like, well, Josh McDaniels is there and Zamir White's there, so I'm not going to draft Josh Jacobs. This was like an industry-wide thing. There was very few people who were in on Josh Jacobs. So, Dave, I think you bring up an awesome point. I think it's just going to be so much of kind of working through those layers, separating things like opportunity, talent, and then just taking a look at that offense and being able to project that pretty well. Lesson number 5 here. Oh, and big shocker, you've got another medical lesson for us. You're such a basic B.
I am very basic. But I want to talk about ACLs. I'll tell you the lesson at the end, but I think ACLs still seem so misunderstood. And anyone who has any injury of the knee, and if the letters ACL are mentioned anywhere, people think that's all there is to it. There is a lot of nuance, and I'm specifically talking about running backs, but there's a lot of nuance to ACL injuries. There are multiple ligaments there for stability. You've heard of the LCL, the PCL, the MCL. There's also the meniscus. If your meniscus gets hurt, this is what happened to Saquon. You can't even start your rehabilitation process until much later. You are non-weight bearing, meaning you can't put any weight on that leg for much longer. So stop using ACLs as a catch-all term for figuring out what's going to happen. You have to look at each injury a little separately. But there are some big takeaways you can use moving forward. One of them, ACL injuries are very common, and running backs are coming back, and they're doing much better than they ever have. Like Dave said earlier, it used to be a death sentence, and it's not. But outside of 2 very glaring exceptions from very elite sort of athletes, very, very, very few running backs can come back in that first year after an ACL injury and be great. The 2 exceptions, of course, are Jamal Charles and Adrian Peterson, who truly just blew everyone away. Those are very rare, and those were pure ACL injuries. And so I don't want to take credit for this. A lot of people looked into this, but no one has done it as well as Matt Betts from the Fantasy Footballers. He has a huge article talking about what happens with ACL injuries in running backs. And pretty much, if you were younger than 26 and you were in your first year, you had a chance of being really good into your second year. And even before this sort of article came out, we were talking about Saquon Barkley, and I was like, 2 years ago, guys, Saquon Barkley, I'm really, really doubtful that he's going to be great. We talked about it on our show, Alfredo, and he was okay, but we talked about how in year 2, he would probably get back to where he was, and we saw that too. And he is an elite athlete, and even he struggled in coming back. So my big picture takeaway here is, if you're playing Dynasty, let's say, get that guy on his discount. Saquon Barkley, I knew he wasn't going to be that great when he first came back. I got him everywhere, and I reaped those rewards this year. And that's just one example. So Javonte, I think, might be a good example. Now, his was a little complicated. His was not an isolated ACL. He hurt some of his other ligaments there, too. I expect him to not be stellar when he comes back. If someone wants to sell him, I would buy on that discount, because I think he will be much better in the latter half of the year and probably back to the Javonte we've all been wanting the year after. So quick takeaway, quick summary. Most people do way, way better in year 2. Year 1 is still a bit of a hit or miss. And if you're going to bet on an ACL, bet on the guy who's younger than about 26, 27 years old.
So let me throw a player out there so you can try to give some actionable advice here. J.K. Dobbins. I mean, we saw it last year, and his was obviously not a clean ACL only. I mean, he ripped everything in his knee. But we saw last year where, he'd get in the open field and his knee was stiff. I mean, he was not running like the old J.K. Dobbins. So now heading into 2023, being another year removed from that ACL, do you think that we see him return to his pre-injury form?
I think this is the best chance he has. This year is the chance where he would be closest to his pre-injury form. I don't see why he couldn't be. Now his was potentially a little bad, and I don't know, maybe he came a little too early. My initial lesson was going to be, don't trust a player who says they're ahead of their timeline, because they're all lying to you and none of them are ahead of their timelines. Like Dobbins was out there telling someone I'm not limping when he was clearly limping. And we saw that he was really stiff. But actionable advice, J.K. Dobbins, I think, is still currently in discount territory. And he's someone I like a lot, actually, as someone I might want to grab when in some of those later rounds when you might be able to find him. Dave, I don't do as much best ball as you do. Just out of curiosity, do you roughly know where J.K. Dobbins is sitting these days?
Last I saw, he was going in like the third, fourth round. So I think people are anticipating a bounce back.
Yeah.
I think the most promising sign for J.K. Dobbins is even last year when he looked far from 100%, he was still getting an elite workload. I mean, Gus Edwards was kind of pushed out of the picture towards the end of the year, and J.K. Dobbins was getting all of the run despite not looking 100%. So if he can show any improvement from that injury this offseason, I think that we see him with a massive workload next year.
Yeah, Vig, we talked about a couple of different young running backs here coming off of injuries. I think another one that probably on a lot of people's minds, especially dynasty managers, Breece Hall was a lot of people's number one rookie pick last year. He obviously has the ACL injury and relatively early in this past season, right? What's kind of the expectation here? Because I think that there's going to be a lot of expectation that as long as he's out there for training camp, that's going to mean that he's healthy. And I think that if we're talking the same thing for both kind of Javonte, Breece Hall, and I know not all injuries are equal, right? But is this something that maybe fantasy managers should be wary of and kind of look for the injury discount, but not necessarily rely on the production? Is that something that fantasy managers should be looking at?
That's exactly my takeaway. I suspect he will be back for training camp because of how early this was. I also suspect that he is not going to be perfectly back to his pre-injury form. And he was doing really well before he got hurt. I really do think that the first few weeks and maybe even the first half of the season are when you're going to see Breece Hall not be the Breece Hall you want. And again, I think that's where discount territory is. I think right now there's so much optimism that I don't know that you get that discount. My best guess is that he doesn't either get that workload or he struggles a little bit early on, and that's the time I think to really get Breece Hall, because I think starting in about that later second half of the year is where we see Breece Hall be great, if at all. But honestly, a couple years from now, I think we're talking about the 2024-25 season. I think Breece Hall is going to be back to exactly where we wanted him to be.
And I think the big issue with Breece Hall, too, is that everybody knows that it was a very clean ACL tear. What we saw on a small sample size last year was so extraordinary that the problem is you can't really get him at a discount. I think people know how good he is going to be. They know that this should be something. I think most people are anticipating a slow start to next year. I just checked on Keep Trade Cut, hoping that maybe he had fallen in rankings a little bit. He is still the Dynasty RB1.
Whew, okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing him not just in Dynasty, even for some redraft mock drafts. I'm still seeing him go in round one. Yep. It seems almost different than how people were valuing Saquon Barkley coming off of his injury. I think it was because Saquon got the follow up with the ankle and whatnot. But it seems like some of these guys, Breece Hall, Javonte, they're going to stay very high up there on those draft boards. And I don't know that I want to take that risk so early in my draft.
Yeah, I know we have other lessons to get to, but I just really want to reiterate what you said, Alfredo. I think the question we have to ask ourselves with injuries is not, can my player or can this player come back and do well? I think the question you got to ask is, does the preponderance of data show that this person is likely to do well?
Big said preponderance.
I got to use at least one word every time, right? One of my professor words every time, right? But does the overwhelming data and evidence show that this player is likely to do well? I think is the question we have to ask. So can Breece Hall be worth a first round pick? Yes. Will he? Man, I want to just put my money on this early, which is way too early. No, I do not think. Talk to me at the end of the year, at the end of the season. I do not think Breece Hall is going to be a top 12, maybe running back. So let's see what happens. But yeah, I'm worried about his injury. He would be a big outlier. The data suggests that he's not going to be that good this year.
The one thing I'll say with Breece Hall, and I know we've stayed on this topic for a long time, so I'm sorry to keep going on, but I think it's an interesting discussion, is you have to weigh the late season games so much heavier when you're in the playoffs, and those games matter more. And I think that's why people are drafting Breece Hall still so early. They might know that he might not be 100% to start the year, but I think the hope is that by the end of the season, he'll be over a year removed from that injury, and he's still got the youth on his side that helps so much that I think people are hoping that he'll be that top, 3 elite running back to close out the season and help win some championships.
And you know what? We've been on this topic for a while. I'm going to give one last little layer, one last little nuance. is coaching is going to be big here. And all of the we're talking about Nathaniel Hackett, who everyone hated him because of Javonte Williams and how that was going. And all of the split shares that he has had for years in Green Bay, regardless of who the running backs were. And then now we're talking about Sean Payton being over in Denver with Javonte, where he's typically tried to deploy a 2 running back system, or he's even put a tight end at quarterback and let him run around. Man, I don't know. Like, guys, I think the injury is one thing, but I think that it's also going to be these coaches trying to prevent these players from getting re-injured and understanding how important they are to their offense. And man, I think that could be the final nail in the coffin for some of these guys and their fantasy value. Also, Vig, I can't get over the fact that you still use the word preponderance, but I couldn't figure out basic rudimentary math. It's just it's another week of just you establishing your dominance as the smarter person on the show. So thanks, man. So with our final lesson here, I was bullied into upping the ante on this a little bit. So originally I started out with Travis Kelce is worth a top 6 draft pick in 2023 redraft leagues. And Dave Kluge, of course, the kind, gentle soul that you are, you're like, no, dude, say it with your chest. Come out here and give some authority on the podcast. And it's like, all right, fine, I'll do it. I'll get a little bit spicier. I kind of like to live in that gray area. But here we go. Travis Kelce is worth a top 3 draft pick in 2023 redraft leagues. And Travis Kelce is not just doing well in fantasy, but I mean, he's getting ready to take over as the maybe top tight end ever in the NFL. It's absolutely nuts. And so let's take a look at what Travis Kelce was able to do last year. It's more of a takeaway than really a lesson, but Travis Kelce, 19.2 fantasy points per game last season, a top 12 tight end on average, minus Travis Kelce, so the remainders averaged about 10.9 fantasy points per game, so under 11 points. Vig, let's do some quick math again here. 19, 11, what are we talking about? What's our difference here?
8 again.
I really like how you stuttered. You got like a little bit worried. So if we're talking about a nearly guaranteed 8-point advantage over your league mates, right? And then also the added advantage of not having to go onto the waiver wire and look for a new tight end. Like, how many people got super excited about Greg Dulcich midway through the year and kept Chigo Okonkwo, and we start talking about all these guys that were fun waiver wire ads, but man, that got annoying to try to stream them, and you're excited, and then they give you a dud, and then you're like, well, I'm not starting them next week. And then they go out and they give you 20 points and off like 3 touchdowns. And you're like, what? And that's just one of the most annoying things in fantasy football, is trying to stream a position where there's not a whole heck of a lot of advantage. And that's what Travis Kelce gives you here. And when you look at him outside of the tight end position, he was the 9th highest scoring non-quarterback, so flex eligible player in fantasy football. And a lot of those guys that finished ahead of him, talking about like, and I'm predicting here, right? But guys like Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, Cooper Kupp, potentially, Devontae Adams, potentially, may not finish as high as they did this past year. It all depends on the quarterback situations for their teams, the teams they end up on, and some of them like Derrick Henry, the age cliff thing, and what's going on with that offense. So in 2023, there's really only one guy for sure that I want to take before Travis Kelce in redraft, and it's Justin Jefferson. And I think that Justin Jefferson should probably be the number 1 pick everywhere. I think there's some arguments to be made for other guys to be in the top 3, Jamar Chase, Christian McCaffrey, and I'm sure there's plenty of other names that people will argue for the next 6 months, of course, because that's what we do. But Travis Kelce, he's been the tight end scoring leader. Let's just go back historically. He's been the tight end scoring leader in 5 of the last 7 seasons. Like, there's not another player in fantasy football that we can look at and say he has been the best at what he does for nearly all set of the last 7 seasons. And mind you, the 2 years that he wasn't number 1 in the tight end position, he was number 2. So you're looking at a guy that's incredibly consistent. He doesn't get injured. He's missed only 3 games in the last 8 seasons. All right. And then we're talking about a guy that, when you look at all of this, the totality of it, Travis Kelce, he's giving you the ultimate blend of safety, upside, and positional advantage. And these are all things that every single fantasy analyst will pound the table for getting these things out of your first round pick: safety, upside, and positional advantage. And if Travis Kelce can do that, I want to take him in the top 3 picks every single time that he is there. And I'm sure I say all this right now, and by the time September rolls around, I will get echo chambered and bullied again because apparently I'm soft, and I'll get talked into dropping him down my draft board again. So Dave, please bully me just a little bit more.
Well, I started looking at the numbers today, and I was kind of surprised because I was fading Kelce pretty hard last year. And really, my big stance was that no tight end over the age of 32 had ever eclipsed 1,000 yards. But really, I should have looked a little bit deeper and not set that threshold at an arbitrary 1,000 yards, because Tony Gonzalez is the glaring example of somebody who played well into his 30s. He was first team All-Pro at 36 years old. His final season in the league, he was 39 years old and put up almost 900 yards. But then I started looking. That 1,000-yard mark hasn't been eclipsed since Travis Kelce did it last year. But we see guys like, Tony Gonzalez, obviously, Antonio Gates, Ben Watson, Shannon Sharp, Delaney Walker, Rob Gronkowski, putting up pretty good seasons, 800 yards plus well into their 30s. So I'm not going to make the mistake of fading Travis Kelce again, especially with Tyreek Hill out of the picture. He is that offense right now. There's no reason to think that he can't put together another 2, 3, maybe even 4 more elite seasons. So I'm with you. Right now, Travis Kelce is my 102 behind Justin Jefferson.
And honestly, I don't know where I was going with that. I was going to say something along the lines of like, could you make a case for him being 101? Because I just saw him going at the 101 in 3 different drafts. But honestly, maybe it's not that crazy.
I've seen
after all.
I've seen it. I've seen it happen. Adam Azer over at CBS Sports, he took Travis Kelce 101 in a redraft mock draft. So it is very possible.
It is, so anytime we're talking about a tight end going at the possible 101, like I completely agree. I think top 3 at least. I think it's hard for me to take him over JJ, or Justin Jefferson, but I like this a lot, and I think a lot of people are going to find this controversial, and so I think I'm really going to try anytime I'm in the top 3 to get Travis Kelce if I can.
Yeah, I think Cooper Kupp's the guy that you see a lot of people making an argument for, but similar age to Travis Kelce, and he's coming off a bad injury and doesn't have that positional advantage of being a tight end. So give me Travis Kelce over Cooper Kupp without thinking twice.
I think what you're going to see in a lot of the home leagues, which is what you see every year, running backs are going to get pushed up the board. And I think we're talking right now, we're saying something where, we think we're being slick, saying, Travis Kelce needs to be a top 3 pick, but I don't think you're going to see that in many home leagues at all. I think you're still going to see him be pick number 9, 10, 11, 12, back end of the first, because we were talking about what a good pick he was this year. And he was still at an average draft position of 14th. A lot of people still weren't even taking him in the first round. So I think that he might get pushed up a little bit more, but I don't know that you're going to see a lot of home leagues drafting him in the top 6, 7, 8 picks. So I think that if you are a savvy fantasy football player and you think you're one of those guys that kind of have a leg up on the rest of your league, I think this is one of those things to really consider, is taking a look at Travis Kelce early in your drafts, because that's what's going to be able to separate you. I hope that with these 6 lessons that we were able to provide today, we are giving you a lot of good information to help you win your leagues in 2023. And I hope we helped you win your leagues here in 2022. That's it for us today. We are going to be back next Thursday with our first 2023 rookie mock draft episode. We're going to take a look at all the incoming rookie class, react to the Senior Bowl. For myself, for Dr. Vig, and award nominee Dave Kluge. Adios.